Hi, my name is Dan Wells and I'm a content writer here at CARE. In our last set of Foundations videos, we began to look at how we should live as Christians. We considered Jesus' call to his followers to pursue justice and to live a life of holiness. In his letter to the church in Rome, the Apostle Paul sums up Christian living very simply with these words: hate what is evil, cling to what is good. But this raises an important question. How do we know what is good and what is not? As we live as followers of Jesus, what is right and what is wrong? These questions of right and wrong are questions of ethics, and that is the subject of this next set of Foundations videos. The subject of ethics is concerned with the question of right and wrong and how we work out which is which. Christian ethics is concerned with how we discern right and wrong as a disciple of Jesus Christ. Or as Paul put it, how to avoid what is evil and to cling to what is good. The first thing to say is that Christian ethics has to begin with God himself. If we want to know what is good, then we have to start with the source of all goodness, our good God. For a Christian, right and wrong need to be defined by God and not by ourselves or by the culture around us. Jesus was asked about right and wrong when he was quizzed about the greatest commandment in the scriptures. In Matthew chapter 22, he answered, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself." Our first ethical duty as Christians is to love God. And from that flows our second ethical duty to love others. Ethics starts with God and then affects all of our relationships. And if Christian ethics starts with God, we need to listen carefully to what God has said. That means we need to read and study the Bible in order to know the right way to live in relationship with God. The Bible contains a great deal of ethical teaching and commands, both in the Old Testament and in the New. But some of those commands can seem a bit confusing, especially as we consider the Old Testament law. There we find commands we find quite easy to understand, although probably less easy to live out. Commands such as love your neighbor and you shall not murder. They sit alongside other commands that are much more difficult to apply. Do not reap to the very edges of your field, for example. Do not wear clothing woven of two kinds of material. And of all the creatures living in the water, anything that does not have fins and scales you may not eat. Which of these commands should we obey today, and which no longer apply to us? To answer that question, we need to read and to understand the Bible carefully. We need to think about the context of the passage, both in the Bible and in the historical and cultural context. We need to consider the author's intent. What is this part of the Bible here for? Most importantly, we need to see how each command fits into the big story of the Bible, the story of God's rescue plan through Jesus' death and resurrection. Jesus himself said in Matthew chapter 5, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them." All of the Old Testament, indeed all of the Bible, points to Jesus and finds its meaning and purpose in him. So to understand the ethical commands of the Bible, we need to see how they point to Jesus and reveal who he is and what it means to follow him. Experts in ethics call this normative ethics. And it's the process of working out why something is right or wrong and what the deeper ethical idea might be. As we approach the Bible, we want to both understand the command, but also the principle behind the command. Why is this command given? What bigger ethical idea lies behind it? And how does it show us the character and desires of God himself? Jesus does this work of normative ethics with the Pharisees throughout the Gospels. The Pharisees were experts in the Old Testament commands, but they continually miss the deeper ethical principles that underpin those commands. So Jesus tells them in Luke chapter 11, "Woe to you, Pharisees, because you give God 1/10 of your mint, rue, and all other kinds of garden herbs, but you neglect justice and the love of God." The Pharisees knew what the law said inside and out, but they failed to truly understand it. They thought they knew what God wanted, but Jesus tells them to go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. Jesus urges the Pharisees to do the hard work of looking not only at the Bible's commands, but also discerning the meaning behind the command. And we are to do the same to fully understand what it means to live for Jesus. So, let's take this idea and apply it to some of the commands we have considered already. Let's start with "you shall not murder," a simple and important command to take seriously. But underpinning the command is this idea that we are created in God's image, and God himself gives us life and breath. We are not to destroy God's image in another person and to take away what God has given. Well, what about the command of all the creatures living in the water? Anything that does not have fins and scales, you may not eat. In other words, can we eat prawns and other shellfish or not? Well, this is a specific command to Israel to help them to live in the land and to make them distinct. These food laws are overturned in the New Testament, as Jesus invites both Jews and non-Jews to be part of his kingdom. So thankfully, prawn curry is back on the menu. And then we have "do not wear clothing woven of 2 kinds of material." Well, this command was given to the people of Israel to be visibly distinct from the nations around them and to show that they were committed to God alone. Now, I suspect I'm violating that command right now, and you may be too. Being distinct from those who don't follow Jesus isn't done with the clothes that we wear anymore. But the command to live distinctive lives certainly continues today. Well, what about the command, "Do not reap to the very edges of your field"? Well, that was a very practical command that provided for the poor and destitute who had no other way of getting food in Old Testament times. They could take food from the edges of fields for themselves and for their families. This system simply doesn't work in the same way today, but the principle of providing for the poor is something that we must continue to take seriously. And love your neighbor? Well, Jesus repeats this command and makes it even more powerful. He challenges our idea of who our neighbor might be and who we ought to show love and compassion toward. Applying the Bible to ethical questions involves a great deal of study and thought. We're going to do that over the next videos in this series. Ethical thinking is challenging, but it allows us to know what it means to live well in God's world, to hate what is evil, and to cling to what is good.